Y'all want to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9? We're going to continue on.
We want to.
Huh? You do want to? Okay. We're going to continue on in Paul's letter to the Corinthians here. You know, we talked about, we've already discussed, y'all who've been here, all the issues that the church in Corinth had, and this continued on. You know, I don't think they had some ups and downs. They got where they were better, and then they kind of struggle again, and there's some letters by different church people later on. They said even as far as 95 AD, which is probably, 50 years later, they were back having problems again. Sort of like we do, Churches do good. You've probably heard of churches that really had it going on a few years ago, and now they struggling and have dropped off, and their attendance has fell off. Huh? And
Never have, huh?
and it's just like that. Main reason being that churches are full of people, right? And none of us are perfect by no means. And you come in and say I found a perfect church. Well, just hang around there a little while. You joined in, so it's not going to be that great. Yeah.
Terry
told me going out to church one day that same thing. They were looking for the perfect church, and I said, "Well, please don't join this one."
I'm telling you. Yeah. Yeah.
That's like Elena asked me Friday
come
night.
back
She
either.
said, "You go by a bunch of churches, so why do you come here?" I said, "Because the Lord told me, and I do what the Lord told me."
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I ain't gonna question nobody about that.
We got a blessed church.
Yeah, we are blessed. There ain't no doubt about it. And it's blessed, and it ain't perfect. And the church I came from was the same way. It was really blessed, but it wasn't perfect by any means. But so anyhow, as we go in here, remember, Paul, he's trying to help this church. Paul probably spent more time in the church in Corinth than any other. When he went and went into that city and began preaching the gospel and setting up the church at Corinth, he stayed there for almost 2 years. Ma'am? Okay. So anyhow, and then he came back at a later time and spent some more time with them. So he probably, well, I ain't no doubt, he spent all total at least 2 years with the church at Corinth. That was probably longer than he ever spent with any of them. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Mary. He loved the church. He wanted to deal with them, but they had a lot of issues, and they had some people in there that spent a lot of time tearing him down. And can you imagine, trying to tear down Paul? I mean, what kind of mindset is that? But it's just like I say, it's no different than nowadays. You get some preachers come in that are tough on their people. I don't mean tough, like tough love. Some are just mean, and sometimes the people, they're just mean to the pastor. Sometimes, sometimes maybe they have a good reason to, and other times they don't. That's just like I said. It's just people. But anyhow, Paul's trying to explain himself here to them at this time, and he's trying to tell them, I got just as many rights as y'all got, believe it or not. He's defending himself a little, I guess. So he says here in chapter 9, he says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? He did, remember, on the road to Damascus. Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? He's saying all this. They can't deny it. You know, they're the product of his preaching and what the Lord sent him to do. And he says, if to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. They're the seal, just like the king's seal. You know, he would get that seal made of wax and he'd stamp it. He'd dip it in that wax and stamp it on the letter or the document. Yeah, that's what he's saying right here. This is my seal. You know, I delivered you people to Jesus, and this is my seal on it right here, that I'm an apostle. He said, this is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do other apostles and brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So in other words, they were doing the work of the ministry and the work of apostleship. And he didn't have a wife. He's talking about him and Barnabas. They didn't have wives. Cephas or Peter and James and the others, they had wives, and they took their wives with them wherever they went. But Paul didn't have a wife. Some people say that maybe he had been married at one time, but I ain't never seen no evidence of it. And apparently Barnabas wasn't married. He said, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? In other words, he's saying, you know, we deserve to be able to make a living from preaching the gospel. Not doing it, you know, for gain or Benny Hinn style, you know, seeing how much money you can get out of people or something like that, but to be able to live and survive, you know, and you know, where they can do the things they need to do for the gospel. They had that right, but they didn't use it. Paul, you know, was a tent maker by trade. That's how he made his living. I ain't never built no tent, but I expect the tents like you used to make. There's probably a lot of sewing and hard work involved in it, I expect. I mean, old-timey hand sewing, not, you know, Singer sewing machine sewing. So I expect it was hard work. Plus, you had to, you dyed them. They had, you know, big places where they put the tents in there and dyed them, and they probably had to get in there with it or stir it in that dye. It's probably really hard work. And also, in Corinth, there was Priscilla and Aquila, you know, the husband and wife. They were Jews that had come to Christ, and they had been run out of Rome when the emperor cast all the Jews out of Rome, and so they had went to Corinth. So he was working there with them and Barnabas, all making their own livings right there. Besides, you know, leading the church in Corinth as a pastor or apostle or whatever he called himself, I don't know. But he's saying, you know, we have a right to eat and drink. We have a right to bring along a wife. And he said they have the right to not work and make a living, you know, spreading the gospel and doing what they do and teaching and leading. Like you said, who serves as a soldier at their own expense? And, you know, if you go out there and plant a vineyard, you're going to hope you're going to get to eat some of it one day, right? Or raise a flock, you know, without getting some of the milk. But Paul didn't do any of these things. He didn't, you know, he worked. He worked. And he says, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. In other words, you know what he's talking about. When that ox is treading on the grain, you know, you're not supposed to keep him where he can't eat some of it. You know, he gets some of it too. So Paul says, is it for oxen that God is concerned? Well, yeah, but that's not what he's particularly talking about. Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. So in other words, the guy who's doing the plowing and the thresher, they all hoping they're going to get something out of this, right? You know, to survive on. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? So Paul's defending himself right here, and I'll tell you why. There was particularly one man, he's never named, which we wouldn't have known him anyways, but there's at least one man, or either a group of men, who were constantly on Paul's case. Like, who does he think he is? You know, coming in here and telling us how we ought to be living and doing and stuff like that. It just kind of reminds me of the other day I was reading in Numbers about Dathan and some of the others in the camp of Israel when they were in the wilderness. You know, they started talking real bad about Moses. You know, and I can tell you, God did not like people talking bad about Moses.
That's the God's name.
Yeah, he was one of the humblest. It said he was the humblest man that ever lived. Moses was, and so Dathan and some of the others, his wife and some of the others, they come up and say, "Well, look here. Why aren't we good enough to go in there? We're Levites. Why aren't we good enough to go in there and offer sacrifices before the Lord and go in there?" Said, "What's wrong with us? You know, who said that you should be the boss?" You know, in other words, so they were just defying God's will on that. You know, that's a sad situation. But y'all remember what happened to Dathan? Him and his whole family, the earth opened up and swallowed them up, because the will of God is not going to be thwarted. Whatever God puts out there, and God does not like that grumbling. He don't like grumbling. You know, so whenever you're grumbling about the way things are going sometimes, or how your life is going, and going on and on about that, you need to stop and think about what's going on. You know, we need to be giving praise to God and thanks for what He's given us, and look forward. So I give you another example. Y'all may have heard this before. I was listening to Charles Stanley one time. You know, he's with the Lord now, but he was talking about years and years ago when he was pastoring at a First Baptist in Atlanta, but way back in the day when he hadn't been there all that long, I don't think. He said they were, I don't know how their system works on their voting and all that kind of stuff like that, but there was something that they were going to do, you know, to help the church and help the church grow. And I can't remember what it was, so I'm not even going to speculate. But anyhow, they had one man on the board of deacons or elders or whatever they called them who was against it. One man. And they had to all be in agreement on it or it couldn't happen. And they had all prayed and prayed about it. And they felt like this is what the Lord wanted them to do. But this one man said no. He just said, no, we're not going to do that. And so Pastor Stanley, he didn't know what to do. He was telling this on his show one time. And he said after a while, he got a call one night. And this particular man that was the holdout, he had died suddenly. And he died in his bed very suddenly in the middle of the night. And it was about the time, they were going to have to make a decision one way or another. So anyhow, the man was buried. Hopefully he went to be with the Lord. But the plan went on through. Plan went through, and the church profited from it, or did well on it, and the Lord was glorified. So you don't ever know. And I've seen instances, in my years as being a deacon and stuff like that. I've seen instances, and if you think about it, there's a good chance you have too, that I just ain't going to talk about. But where the Lord has done things to change a situation, because people being stubborn, hard-headed, not wanting to listen, when the Lord's trying to move. So you better be sure that you're not letting yourself get in the way of what the Lord's trying to do. Because if you do that, that's a dangerous situation, because if God wants it done, you're not going to stop it, And if you've got a good reason and an honest reason, you can sit down and talk about it, but you just need to be sure that you're on the Lord's side. You remember when the angel was standing, when Joshua saw the angel with a sword in his hand, and he said, are you on our side or our enemy's side? You remember what the angel said? He said, no, I'm on the Lord's side. Said, in other words, he's telling them, y'all just need to make sure you're coming over here with me. Because I'm on the Lord's side, and that's the side you need to be on. So that I'm not on anybody else's side. That's where we need to be. And yeah. I mean, he's standing there with that flaming sword. But anyhow, these guys right here, as we're talking about, they were giving Paul a hard time, and so he's defending himself, not to make himself look great. But verse 12, it says, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? And he said, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Now that's an awesome statement right there. Paul knows he has that right. He could put it on them. And Corinth was a very rich city. They actually had 2 ports on either side of the city, and they took in a lot of business. So it was a pagan city to the max. They had a lot of temples there to idols. They were pagan, and they were a wicked city, but they were a wealthy city too. So but anyways, Paul didn't take anything from them. He didn't want to, because he did not want to put a stumbling block in the way of him preaching the gospel. And he goes on to say here in verse 13, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? He's talking about the Levites right there, the people that worked in the temples. The Levites, they ate of these sacrifices. The sacrifices that were made that weren't completely burned up, they got to take some of the food with them. They were fed. And whether it was the meat, whether it was the grain, whatever, they got a portion of all that. They had no land in Israel. They had no permanent land, but they had, they didn't have it sectioned off to them like all the other tribes did. But they had areas, they had their own towns that were given them, and they had pasture land for their animals. So the Lord's looking after them. And the people, provided these things not only for sacrifices, but for the Levites. In the same way, in verse 14, he says, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. That's just what he says. In verse 15 he says, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. So Paul said, I have a right to this stuff, but I'm not using that right. He said, and I'm not telling you that I expect to get it. Now this is what he says right here. Listen to this. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. In other words, if they're going to resentfully give him something, he would just rather die than get that. It's not going to stop him from doing what he's doing. And that's why he continues to do it, because that's his calling. God called him to do it, whether he's recompensed for it or not. He says, verse 16, for if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. He can't brag about it. He's got nothing to brag about. He said, for necessity is laid on me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. And I can say the same thing for me. And you know what? Same thing can be said for everybody in here. I'm not talking about, being a preacher or a pastor or something like that, but whatever it is God's called you to do, all I can say, if you don't do it, woe to you. The Lord's called you to do it. And we can come up with all the excuses in the book. But if the Lord's called you to do it, you need to do it. He said, for I do this of my own will. In other words, he's doing it because he wants to. He's doing the Lord's will because it's his will too. He's in tune with God. And Lord, that we would all be that way. That we serve God with all our strength, soul, mind, and heart, because our will is so tuned in there with the will of the Lord that we know that's what we need to do. For I do this of my own will. Remember when the Lord was talking about whatever you desire, if you ask for it, you'll be given it. I didn't get the words exactly right on that, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Jesus said that. Well, does that mean that, Lord, I've been having my eye on that Mercedes for a while? And don't get me wrong, I ain't knocking Mercedes. If somebody goes and buys a Mercedes, don't say, well, Brother Rusty said that was a sin. It's a fine automobile. If you go get one, that's fine. You'll never hear me say a word about it. But I may go get one. Probably not.
Well, hurry on up.
Yeah. So what he's saying here is our will, if we're in tune with God, our will is going to be in line with his will. And that means whatever we have, whatever we do, whatever we say, we're going to make sure, Lord, is this what you want? Yes. And I can tell you, I could sit here, and if I wanted to study on it a while, I can think of 100 things or more during my life as a Christian where I went ahead and did something, whether I asked the Lord, was it something he wanted me to do or not? And sometimes it worked out okay, and sometimes it didn't, But I think back and thought, well, I should have prayed about that more and sincerely asked the Lord what he wanted me to do about that. But if we're in line with God's will, our will is going to be tied in with his. That's when you're walking with God. Many, many times. So he goes on to say, for I do this of my own will. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I'm still entrusted with the stewardship. So listen right here, whether it's his will or not, God still laid that burden upon him, that stewardship, Just like if Miss Mary Gray had called me that second time and asked me, well, have you thought any more about, being pastor here? If I'd have just said, no, I'm just not going to do that, I could have went on and lived my life and probably still be going right now and maybe still be a deacon at Springfield Baptist Church. But the fact is that the Lord entrusted me with that stewardship, and I didn't follow it. I got a friend right now that feels like, he didn't do what the Lord called him to do. And he's a fine Christian man, but he says, I missed my opportunity. I don't really know what to tell him, that's between him and the Lord. I try to encourage him and everything, but he really feels like several years ago he had his opportunity and he didn't use it. I can't say whether that's true or not. That's between him and God, but I think it's possible you can miss out. And personally, I think a church can miss its opportunity.
Yes.
I really believe that. I believe people and churches both can miss the opportunities the Lord gave them. And right now at this church, I'm seeing and I'm saying and I'm believing that we got an opportunity right here to do things. Does that mean fill up the church and up yonder and everything? I don't know. That'd be great if we did.
We could use some help.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the thing about it is, the opportunities the Lord's given us now,
Yeah.
we need to use them while we got them. Because He's not going to force us to do anything. That means following the calling and the stewardship He's given us. So as he goes on to say, I am still entrusted with the stewardship. The Lord still put it on him. He went to his grave still feeling that way. He said, what then is my reward? So he does have a reward for what he does. And we all do. When we serve the Lord, we've all got a reward. And we may see some of it in this life, we may not. But we've all got that reward that the Lord is going to present us with. That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So in other words, you ain't charging anybody for the message he gives out, the good news of Jesus Christ. Although it's his right, he says, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He goes on in verse 19. Before we go any further, anybody have anything that stuck out to them they want to comment on? All right. Verse 19, he says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. In other words, he's got perfect freedom in Christ. We've all got perfect freedom in Christ, but at the same time, we're servants of Christ. And if you go back to the original language, it's talking more like a slave.
Yeah, free slave.
You're a slave to Jesus Christ, yet you're free.
Yes.
Now I know that sounds like a paradox, but it's the truth. I've thought about that a lot. There's more freedom in being a slave to Christ than there is being in this world, a slave to this world.
You are redeemed.
That's right.
It's an honor.
That's right. That's right. Redeemed. He goes on to say here, he made himself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. And we see examples of that in the book of Acts. You remember, he got Timothy, who was half Jewish but had never been circumcised. When he went with them, he got Timothy to be circumcised. Did he do that because he believed that it did any good? No, Paul had got way past that point about Jewish laws. He did it because he knew they were going to be in a lot of places and ministering to Jewish people, and he didn't want there to be a problem to come up. In other words, some people might say, well, he was just giving in to them people. No, he was trying to reach them for Christ. And by this way, he's presenting young Timothy with them as, a Jewish man. And if they find out, well, he's half Gentile, And, you know, they could just say, well, he's been circumcised. You know, I'm not all in on the ins and outs of Jewish society and Jewish law back in that time, for sure, but I trust Paul's judgment on that he was doing the best he could do to try to reach all these people, these very legalistic people. And that's what he was doing. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself, being myself under the law. In other words, those that followed all these Jewish traditions and rituals, he went along with them. He still did all those things. To those outside the law, who he's calling Gentiles here, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law, but under the law of Christ. In other words, when he was around Gentiles, he didn't practice all this stuff. He didn't do it. That I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. So in other words, does this mean that he was living in sin like the Greeks and Gentiles did? No. But he was presenting himself to them as though he was not under the legal limits of the Jewish law. He was trying to show, you know, I'm with you. Sort of like Jesus tried to identify with us. Or he didn't try, he did identify with us. But the thing about Paul here, do y'all remember the incident where Peter, he would meet with Jews and that he would, you know, be just fine with the Jews, but when he was with the Jews, he avoided the Gentiles because he didn't want to offend the Jews. And then he was with the Gentiles, he acted like everything was just fine, you know. But let's face it, and Paul called him out on it. Peter was being a little bit two-faced, you know. He's an apostle of God and the Lord used him for great things, but you know what? He's like the rest of us. He wasn't perfect either. So Paul called him out on it. You remember that in the book of Acts? He said, why do you act one way around this group of people and then, you know, y'all fine with them, and then when the Jews come around, you avoid them and won't have anything to do with them. You know, and he basically told Peter, you being a hypocrite. And how did Peter take that? He accepted it. He accepted what Paul was saying to him because he knew it was right, you know. And Lord, sometimes if people come to correct us, sometimes we would just, you know, say, you know what, you're right. Instead of getting mad and bent out of shape, you know. That's why it's hard to go to people sometimes, because it's just, you know, people don't take it well. But Peter took it well. He understood what he was talking about, and he went on to continue to serve God, you know, the rest of his life. And die on an upside down cross. So that's the way Paul was doing it, and that's the way we ought to do it. Just remember, we do it for the sake of the gospel, right?
Yes.
That I may share with them in its blessings. Anybody have anything before we get into this last part? Verse 24, before we get into this, Corinth, as well as a lot of other, especially Greek cities, they were big into sports. That's another way they're a lot like us. They were, of course, they didn't play football or baseball or anything like that, but they had more Olympic style sports. They had races and foot races and wrestling and boxing, even boxing and all that kind of stuff like that. And, you know, it wouldn't be easy to conclude, because you see this in 1 Corinthians and Philippians and other places, Paul talking about these games. I think he enjoyed athletics. Whether he was an athletic person or not, I don't know. But I believe he probably went to some of these games. He probably enjoyed them. But he goes into an athletic mode right here as he says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? In other words, you got to run. You got to run for that prize, and you got to win. He says, so run that you may obtain it. In other words, what is he comparing that to? Our life in Christ, moving forward. If we're standing still, we're not running, that's for sure. And, we've got to forget about what we just did and keep moving forward, to win the race. Yes. A run that you may obtain it. Yes. And that's that prize. Win the prize. Remember we talked about in the other scripture, winning the prize of the high calling in Christ Jesus. You remember that calling that Jesus has given us is a high calling. It's hard to think of a high calling when you get up early in the morning and get ready to go to work or whatever you do. And you got things going on, doctor appointments, this and that. And it's just going to be another day, another week, whatever. But it changes things when you start considering, I've got a high calling from God. That's what my life is all about. It doesn't seem like much on a day-to-day basis, but I've got a high calling from God. And you do. You've got that high calling in Christ. And this is what he's saying right here. He says in verse 25, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. In other words, you ever seen them old wreaths that's made like out of olive branches and they put them on their heads? They're pretty, but they ain't going to last long. They fade away. And, you give them just a few days and they're going to be brown and fragile and they're not going to look good. But they used to run the race and get these wreaths, and then they would go around the stadium, and all the people would cheer them, They won this prize. They won this race. But it's a perishable wreath. We've got an imperishable. The crown that we're going to receive from the Lord is going to light up the sky, I believe. It's going to be a beautiful crown, and at some point we're all going to cast them at Jesus' feet. That's where casting crowns got their name. That's what we're going to get to do, because we're going to humble ourselves before the Lord, but we're still going to receive that crown of life, that crown of glory. It's going to be a big time, a big day. I don't know how long that day's. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be an awesome time, and you're going to see people up there probably that you never expected or thought about receiving great crowns, for the things. Yeah, and they're going to be getting crowns not because, God bless Billy Graham. How many souls came to him, I don't know. I know he's got a great reward ahead of him and great crowns, but I'm going to tell you what, there's people in churches that ain't nobody ever heard of, that never spoke in front of anybody, that the Lord's going to reward them, and their crowns are going to be every bit that big. And I truly believe it. And why is that? Because they were faithful to what he called them to do. Whatever it was, they were faithful to it. I really believe that. I'm not taking nothing away from people like Billy or our missionaries in other countries. They've got great crowns ahead of them for sure. But he says every athlete exercises self-control in all things, and they do it for a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Our rewards are never going away. They're always going to be there. They're not going to be sit up in a room somewhere or in a box in a closet, that all them kind of things always wind up in, they're going to be imperishable. God's always going to reward us. So here's what Paul says he does. This is what it all boils down to in this chapter. He says, so I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air. You know what he's talking about, that shadow boxing right there, where these guys, they get up and shadow box, and they're mostly just training their body and disciplining their body to keep doing them correct movements right there. He's doing it for the real thing. He says, I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. And does that mean he's going to lose his salvation? No. But he can be disqualified. I mean, in other words, if he lets his physical needs and wants go and just does whatever he wants to and doesn't have any discipline for himself, what happens? He's liable to give in to temptation. Lord have mercy. There's so many times I've seen it happen, and you have too, where people who were qualified, I believe they were qualified, I believe they were God called, and they get disqualified. It just scares me to death sometimes when I think of the pastors and preachers I know personally, and also that you read about and hear about that are disqualified. And sometimes later they want to come back, but I don't think that works out. I'm not real crazy about that, but some people, they'll just, they say, well, whatever. But, Paul was making sure everybody understood that he knew that he could get his own self in that position. Paul could have been disqualified. He could have failed, gave in to temptation, done whatever he wanted to do. But he kept himself disciplined. And that's a part of the Christian life. It's kind of, ignored sometimes. Making sure you do the things you need to do, at home, and in your prayer life, in your Bible study. And when you feel like the Lord's calling you to do some kind of ministry or ministering or something like that, actually doing it. It's easy to talk about stuff, but actually getting down and doing it, that's a whole different thing altogether. And so Paul is talking about, he don't run aimlessly. He's not just running around the track, because it's the thing to do. He's got something in his mind. He's got a goal he's pushing towards. He got a goal he's pushing towards. And he don't shadow box, He's not just out there, just beating at the air. Shadow boxing, he's got a goal in his mind. Why am I doing this? He got a goal in his mind. I'm doing this because this is what God called me to do, and I need to discipline myself to make sure I do it. Lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Y'all have all seen preachers on TV that disqualified themselves from the ministry, and it's a sad thing. And I can remember at work, I think it was back in the 80s when all these preachers were failing right and left. Seemed like they were all doing it at the same time. Boy, we had a big time mocking them guys out there at work. We laughed and laughed about them and mocked them so. But now I can look back and I see, it wouldn't be that hard. You get up there in that kind of a position. And so we need to watch ourselves and discipline ourselves and remember who we're serving. Does anybody have anything?
It's a training process.
Oh, yeah.
To keep self-control.
Yeah. You know what? It's going to go on all your life, too. I don't think it ever ends.
You can't let your guard down.
No.
Stay focused.
That's right.
God will.
On the prize.
to mind.
That's right. All right, then, before we go, I want to remember Miss Janice was telling us about her nephew and niece that both of them had cancer. She said her niece died. She died from the cancer. Her nephew, the doctor says he thinks he can do something to help him. Is that right? So, what was his name?
We call him Pete. Jesse was his name. We've always called him Pete.
Pinky?
Pete.
Pete. Okay, I'm sorry. I felt to say he probably wouldn't like Pinky too good. But sure sorry about his wife. That's both of them having cancer. That's something else right there.
What was the name again?
Pete, what's his last name?
I can't think of it.
Oh, that's all right. Miss Janice's nephew, Pete. Yeah. That's Pete. She'll probably come up with it later.
Let us know.
All right.
We'll get it on it.
Wake up tonight thinking about it.
That's right. Got my thoughts.
Anybody else?
Anybody heard anything else from Miss Marilyn today?
I hadn't heard today. Yes, ma'am.
Foster is his last name.
Foster. Pete Foster.
Jesse Foster. Jesse Foster.
Okay.
Jesse's his name, they call him.
Okay. I don't see the tie in there, but whatever.
That's how I meet Miss Janice.
He's filling out them papers for blood work. It asks you all kind of questions.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I couldn't figure out if I was a Caucasian or what. I said, I'm a child of God, I know
That
that.
was not an option, was it? Have that box.
I started to think I was something else.
Some of those questions I didn't know that possible.
Ms. Mary said, how did you, get
I had
them all?
I had to ask them